I want to thank Fan for inviting me to be the keynote speaker for the conference this year. I'm delighted to do so. I remember when Fan began in Washington, D.C. a number of years ago, and I've watched its growth over the years. So I'm really impressed by the work that Fan has been doing in these very critical times of ours. I think the remarks I want to share with you today are, in a sense, what does the Franciscan charism have to offer to a world of chaos and complexity? And are we really in a Franciscan moment? Certainly, the recent encyclicals of Pope Francis lead in that direction. His very insightful Laudato Si of 2015, calling our attention to the destruction of the ecological environment. And more recently, Fratelli Tutti calling us to the destruction of consumerism and individualism and the way we are losing a sense of community, a global community. I would have some thoughts about these encyclicals, but my purpose here is really to share with you why I think a Franciscan approach to these problems could indeed be not just unique, but vital to what the world is seeking today. And I think I would go back to the person of Francis of Assisi himself. A person who was what we might say worldly originally, a materialist, someone who really liked nice things. He would have been a true capitalist in some ways as a young man, but he realized the emptiness of things. Certainly as he was wounded in battle and, was suffering, he began to question his own life, as many of us do. And he realized, and, he was in that moment of suffering, he was open to the voice of God speaking to him and, realized the immense love of God for his own life. And that opening up to God, I think, really marks the journey of Francis of Assisi. And in that respect, I want to say that I think throughout the trajectory of Francis's life, and I do think as developed by Bonaventure, the primacy of the charism really is on contemplation. It's on dwelling in the immeasurable love of God, a love that has spilled over freely to embrace us, to be with us, to empower us. Francis really grew into that love in his own life. He did not have computers or cell phones or wristwatches, and therefore he spent long, long periods of time in nature, in abandoned churches, in lonely hillsides, just being with God. And Thomas of Celano has some beautiful passages, where he describes Francis, really being enveloped in that life of God. Talk of Jesus always on his lips and in his heart and in his ears, in everything he was about. Francis was single focused. There's no doubt about it. He was very strong-willed, and he made the love of God the single object of his heart and of his life. And out of that single-heartedness, he grew into a depth of his own personhood. He came to, in a sense, realize his own need for God. And therefore, that need for God in Francis's life was then also a need for others where God lived. And so as he grew into God's love in his own life, he grew into that same life in the love of the leper, in the love of the birds and the trees and the flowers. And that love became a binding force for him. He began to see himself as a brother, one who was truly related to every level of being in creation. And therefore he, I think what love does, it does several things. One is when we know we are loved, we have a sense of trust. We have a sense of power in the sense that we know we belong to an other. And at the same time, we can free ourselves from the need to control others. And I do think that's what I see with Francis as he grew into that love of God in his life. He loosened the need to control the world around him. He began to live not only as a brother, but as a poor brother. Poverty was not only material things of which he did live, but even more so, it was a spiritual poverty, a psychological poverty in some ways, right? A living without possessing. And that's, very countercultural in our own time, where consumerism is based on possessions. And that sense of ownership in our own age has been very destructive to the pursuit of community and ecological health. But what we see in Francis is that growing into that virtue of poverty was growing into the giftedness of every aspect of life. That the leper and the bumblebee and the flower were not obstacles to his pursuit of God. They were ladders, they were means, they were places where he could find God, as Bonaventure wrote in his itinerarium, in his Legende. In beautiful things, Francis saw beauty itself, and from each and everything he climbed up to embrace his beloved. The whole world became really the church of God, the cathedral, the dwelling place of God. Francis, lived in a life of, you might say, constant praise. His heart was, in a sense, filled with that joy of God's love within him, not without suffering, we might add. And I think, that is what we find with Francis, is that, the deeper he entered into the love of God, the more he was willing to let go of the stuff that he really held on to, in terms of any types of power or judgment. And he was willing to suffer, to sacrifice. Suffering and sacrifice, I think, are countercultural values in our own age. We live in an age of acquisition. How much can I attain? How much can I acquire? And Francis was just the opposite. How much can I let go? Maybe that's our challenge today. How much can we let go and be at home with ourselves and with God? And what we see with Francis is that in the letting go for him was actually an opening up. The more he let go, the more he saw the beauty and splendor of creation in its true goodness, in its God-filled goodness. And yet, the path to love, as Bonaventure tells us, goes through the path of the crucified Christ, that mystery of God, enfleshed, incarnate on the cross, a God who, has gone to the dregs of death, to the tombs of darkness, to the places of nothingness, and has brought divine love there. And that's a mystery for us. We don't want to suffer. We don't like suffering. We try to avoid suffering at all costs. And yet the key to growing in love is learning to suffer well, to suffer through to something higher. And that suffering, I think, can only come about when we know we are loved, right? I think there's a suffering in suffering, and that's the feeling of abandonment, the feeling of aloneness, the feeling of isolationism. And I think Francis felt some of those things. I know that, I think Bill Short has once remarked that Francis suffered a period of depression, and it was very likely that he did suffer a period of real depression, because we know that as the order grew around him, he was not readily accepted by his own brothers. I think, many times they riddled him. They thought he was too stupid, too ignorant, to really be the leader of this fast-growing movement. And so they were happy to see him take off for the road, and to go off for several months at a time. I think the story of perfect joy is probably a story of perfect misery, but yet finding that God does not abandon us in our misery, right? Where Francis, the symbolic story of showing up, freezing cold with icicles, dangling from his clothes, and he's rejected, when he knocks on the door. And he says to us, if you can maintain a sense of peace and a sense of trust, there's perfect joy. Perfect joy in the middle of perfect misery. That's a paradox. And Francis's way is a paradox. And so I think I would say, we sometimes can be too simple about the life of Francis. We do make him into the birdbath saint, as many of my colleagues have remarked over the years. But he really was a man of profound wisdom. He was a man who saw deeply, I think, into the fragility of the human person. And so I guess we ask ourselves, well, what does this mean for us today? This path of love in a world of suffering, this path of love in a world of conflict, this path of love in a world of opposition. And I do think the greatest and maybe the most countercultural stance the Franciscans can take today is to be at home in an immeasurable love of God, to contemplate. I think contemplation precedes action. Actually, contemplation itself is a form of action. It is, in a sense, not acting in opposition. It's acting out of the resolution of love. And I think that's what we find in Francis. The more he could, in a sense, be at home with that love of God within him, the more he found a creative way to deal with the oppositions in his community, to deal with the conflicts with the church, with those around him. Conflict requires creative resolution, right? It does not require more conflict, more opposition. And that creative resolution can only come about when there's a third entity that's pulling us forward, that's pulling us to see in a new way. And I think that's what the love of God did for Francis. It allowed him to see in a new way. It allowed him to act out of a new center. That same kind of vision, that same kind of action is what we need in our own time. We don't need more of the same. More of the same creates a cycle of violence and a cycle of destruction. What we need are people who live on the edge. We need people who see a future. And I think what the love of God did for Francis is it gave him a sense of trust and a sense of hope. We find that at the end of his life, where, as he's dying, he says, "Let us begin now, brothers, for until now we have done nothing." That's an amazing, those are amazing lines. Let us begin for until now we have done nothing. When in fact, the movement had grown to several thousand by the time he died. And yet Francis himself probably died feeling like he might have failed his mission. He tells us in his testament at the end, I pursued what I set out to do, and that was to follow the gospel. Basically he's saying it didn't quite work out the way I had hoped, but I never gave up my original call. And I think that's what he's saying to us. Put your hand to the plow and don't look back. Know what you're committed to. What is it that you really, that you're being really drawn to, and be authentic about it. Don't be two-faced. Don't be drawn this way and that way. And I think for Francis, he did have trust in the power of God to do new things. Even as you read between the lines and his sense of failure, he trusted that God would be there, that God is that future into which we are moving. And so, I think with Francis, we see what Teilhard de Chardin would call a christified life, one in whom the Christ is emerging in this universe. Francis lived a Christogenic life. He was a birth giver. And I think that's what the Franciscans are called to today. We're called to give birth to Christ, right? There must be something about our lives that shines out in the world. People see in us values that they don't see otherwise in the world. That's not to hold us up in a special way. That's to say we are called in a particular way. And so I think, this is a tremendous path. And of course, the whole theology was built on the charism of Francis by Bonaventure, by Scotus, and others. And that charism, that spiritual charism, giving rise to a very rich theological and philosophical tradition, is vital for our age. And again, I see the connection with Teilhard de Chardin. who saw that, in Teilhard's view, the physical universe is love. The energy of the universe is love. And Teilhard sees that the whole universe is oriented toward the fullness of Christ. This is the vision of Scotus. This is the vision of Bonaventure, because it is ultimately and originally rooted in the vision of Francis. May it be our vision as well, because there is much work to do. Francis did what was his to do. May we do what is ours to do. Thank you. Peace and all good to you.